FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Well, all hell is breaking loose on Wall Street thanks to Michael Lewis's book, which confirmed what you and I and Danielle Park have been talking about for years already, that the markets are rigged. And I'm shocked. Aren't you shocked, Danielle?
No, I enjoyed last week. I had to say I was so enjoying listening to the fact that, all this stuff was finally coming out in a mainstream forum, and people were sort of expressing, oh my goodness, that can't be true. And meanwhile, we've been tracking this for the past, really since the HFT first came to my real attention in the spring of 2009 when I was at a function in New York overlooking the New York Stock Exchange, and a couple of the people at the party were telling me how they'd recently just relocated their office from far away to right around the corner from the NYSE, and I was so naively saying, oh, is it nicer office space? They were saying, no, it's closer. We get direct feed from the NYSE, and that gives us a locational advantage in speed, and that makes us able to front run everyone and make quick profits. And my jaw just dropped. I was literally looking at them, thinking I knew these people, thinking that they were nice, regular folks.
You should know better. These are Wall Streeters, Danielle. How could you think that? I never spoke to them again.
I was so offended at the notion. And then when I came back, of course, I did a bunch of research and figured out, of course, this is what they're all doing, And of course, aided and abetted by the exchanges who became for-profit enterprises over the last decade, fixating on how to get their transaction volume up. At the same time that, the average, a lot of investors that are in the know were pulling back from equity markets after the debacle in 2008, after the flash crash in 2010. There's been this general exodus of investor demand. People who are concerned about capital have been pulling back from these markets saying, this is just crazy. We don't understand, how things are moving, but we know that they're all basically rigged by some kind of an algo system. You see trades like the yen Kerry trade being the dominant driving force. It seems like currency's driving everything. And people come on and try and justify movements based on fundamental or economic arguments, and it's got very little to do with that anymore. So it really is this, that someone pulled the top off last week and forced everyone to look at the monster that public markets have become. But it is, the underlying reality of it is there's nothing new in this, number one. Number two, the Feds, the Federal Reserve, are the architect of this, period where investment prospects have become nothing to do with what's going on. It's all to do with liquidity and making things look a certain way, the appearances, the confidence men. All that is exactly what HFT is. It gives the appearance of volume, the appearance of trader buying, of people wanting to buy. But in reality, it's, a bunch of algo trading that can literally vanish in the blink of an eye. 80 to 90% of those trades are canceled without being closed. So when anyone tries to argue it's liquidity-based, it's nonsense because liquidity vanishes whenever there's any stress. And so anyone that's in there, thinking they're participating in investment markets are sorely mistaken.
Okay. And not only this, the fact is, people who are disciplined traders who use like stop loss orders or buy stops, the fact is they've got access to that information and they do stuff to trigger those stops and those buy stops, those sell stops and buy stops, and force you out of the market to take losses that become their gains. Lewis doesn't even get into that, but and I know that's taking place. I've seen it happen. It's happened to me. And it's funny the way you just happen to get stopped out of a stock. It goes negative, and then right away the momentum shifts and it goes back along its merry way because they did it to you deliberately. And that is out and out fraud, which is why I call this, Danielle, high-frequency fraud, and that's what the whole financial system is, high-frequency fraud. The whole purpose of the system is to defraud the largest number of people for the largest amount of money. That's its reason for being.
Well, unfortunately, it has evolved into that. There's still a lot of legitimate people who want to participate and invest, make intelligent allocations of capital. But unfortunately, at the margin, this whole system has been hijacked by those corrupt forces that were, wanton disregard for any kind of justice or transparency or fairness or equitable principles. But that was what blew up in the credit bubble and the subprime fiasco. The 03 to 06 period, let's say, when the anarchists began to run the place. And then because there was no official response to shut anything down in the 08 disaster, in fact, they were bailed out, given more liquidity, backstopped, no one was put in jail. Because of all that, they just became more and more emboldened. So it got worse. And, there's 30 trillion plus more debt in the world today than there was in 2008. And much of that, leverage and liquidity found itself into these reckless trading platforms. You have the Fed condoning everything to reliquify the banks. So in other words, no one's looking at anything because they just want the capital ratios up. That's their sole reason for, continuing to degrade everything else, the taxpayers' balance sheet, their own stability. Everything was thrown under the bus in the name of trying to liquefy the banking system or the banks themselves. So, and then you've got the Keystone cops, as Larry Doyle calls them, the regulators, the FINRAs, the SECs that are, basically run by the big Wall Street banks themselves. And I put that article on today about the retiring lawyer who had been at the SEC since 1986, 66 years old. He's on his way out. On March 27th, he's giving a speech in front of 70 of, SEC lawyers and admin types. And he says, in a speech that's given then to Bloomberg, listen, we're at best, the toll booth collectors and the bankster fraud highway. And he apparently wanted to go after Goldman Sachs and John Paulson, these people who were, in collusion following the subprime in the subprime debacle, how they were taking advantage of investors given preferential access to information, getting to handpick mortgage portfolios to bet against, all that stuff. And they became billionaires, and no one's taken back any money from them. No one's ever, done any serious investigation or criminal allegations against any of those participants. So unfortunately, here he is going out, this lawyer, after a long career there, but, he's saying, this is a joke. The people here are only concerned about trying to get high-paying jobs in the HFT business after they leave the SEC. So they're not seriously going after anyone. And there is no will to do so. Every single one of these people is, at best we check broken glass on the ground floor. No one ever goes up to the penthouse. And if we do, we go with our hat in our hand and, we're so deferential and polite that no one ever calls a liar or a thief a thief. And so here we are.
Here we are. And the HFT is really just the tip, because you and I know we can just go down the list of exchanges and just look who's playing in them, who dominates them. And that every single one is rigged. And on Zero Hedge, perfect example, there's an article right now talking about how gold and silver prices were rigged and using HFT to rig them. And HFT just is a perfect way to rig every market, because you have all these false quotes on the HFT system that create an impression, like you were talking about, of a gold price or a silver price that doesn't really exist. Creates an illusion.
Here's my problem, though. I have no problem agreeing that there's manipulation in everything. My problem is this. Human beings typically never complain or cry foul as long as what they're holding is going up. We've seen this. I've mentioned before that, Herbert Hoover initially started looking into the crash of 29, not to figure out who had pumped the stuff up to ridiculous levels, but who had been the evil short sellers and making price go down. Okay, so that's very common. So when we look at the price of precious metals, It went through the roof into 2008 and then into 2011. And no one was crying anything about, what was keeping prices at unsustainable levels then. And now that everything's come back down, they're saying, well, wait, HFT is keeping these prices down, but they're keeping every other price up. So I just have a hard time following that logic. I agree there's manipulation. I don't think we know what the price level would organically be in any of this stuff. But my impression is, generally, it would be lower across the board. And so I think bonds would be lower. I think stocks would be lower. I think currencies, for the most part, would be lower. And I think that metals prices would be lower. So I just don't know how anyone can speak with confidence or parse that out and say, it's right. The HFT is keeping this stuff up, but this stuff down.
Well, based on this Zero Hedge article, it looks like the prices would be higher, but I'm willing to let the chips fall where they may. I'd like to know just what everything is worth.
Let's just have some chips falling, right? Let's just,
right.
It's some other guy was writing and he said it's the Truman world where you know that you're living in this fool's paradise. It's not the way it really is, and yet you aren't given the option of seeing the truth. And I think, what I was hopeful of last week was all the broad market or the broad media coverage of Michael Lewis because of his fame in the movie. Frankly, because his books became a couple of famous movies. That's the only reason anybody in the broad world really cares, I think. But I was just happy that it brought that focus. There's things like 60 Minutes and Charlie Rose are more likely to spread the word to the average person and say, what are we going to do about this? We don't need to tolerate it. It's not a permanent state of, DNA. We can actually take a stand. We can, for example, make trades have to be on the books for at least a half a second or a second before they can be canceled. Anyone that would argue against that is obviously, nonsense. What kind of a business model would it be for legitimate investing that you can't have a quote last more than a half a second or a second, So a lot of the stuff that we could just put back reasonable basic rules. We don't need 2,000 pages more regulation, just reasonable basic rules and transparency. You could get some things worth working with again.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable. And let's talk some more about reasonable regulations that could be put in place to protect the public on the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio.
People have been using gold and silver to protect their wealth for thousands of years. Shouldn't you? That's why I go to Owings Metals. Their service is outstanding, and you can buy with complete confidence. Order today, and you'll have your metal in your hands in 10 days or less. They help take the guesswork out of the buying process, and you'll buy at the lowest possible prices. Call them today at 855-604-6343, 855-604-6343, or find them on the web at owingsmetals.com and tell them Kerry sent you.
FSN Radio.
When your accountant wants tax-free income, this is what he does. Accountants know the law. They also know that any American could legally get paid up to 3 times per month, 100% tax-free. That's 36 tax-free checks each year. It doesn't matter what you make already. This simple strategy could work for anyone. Go to www.irsrevenge2.com to learn how. That's irsrevenge2.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back. Financial Survival Network. Kerry Lutz talking with Danielle Park. So, let's have real quotes. And if you put a quote up there and you dishonor it, what should the penalty be, Danielle, if it's not a real quote?
Well, I think number one, the exchanges should not be allowed to sell preferential information to some people ahead of others. Number one.
Right.
Number two, you should not have this whole front running should not be allowed. So that would be taken. If they stop getting preferential information ahead of the rest of us, then the front running aspect would be greatly curtailed. They shouldn't be allowed to enter a ton of trades and cancel them in milliseconds before your eye can even blink. So again, extending the period. If you're going to enter an actual quote, has to be legitimate and open for a decent period of time. I think the new IEX exchange that has been brought out by the characters in the Flash Boys book, where an IB, our U.S. broker dealer custodian is actually Interactive Broker. Last week they announced that we could request direct routing to the new IEX exchange that does not let high-frequency trading get ahead of the order flow or purchase preferential access. So some of those basic things, I think, are just pure market forces. I think everyone that's a fiduciary that actually cares about investing markets for their legitimate use is going to try and use a legitimate service provider and take their business away from these, fraudulent forces at regular exchanges where they're abusing us all and treating us like dummies while they take money from, basically crooks getting an unfair advantage. So I think there's a bunch of stuff we can do that's really obvious. The other thing is, though, there needs to be prosecution. And the SEC is a captured entity. FINRA is largely a captured entity by the financial industry itself. So they're very ineffective in bringing about any legitimate prosecution. But, when I saw the Federal Department of Justice announcing they were doing an investigation into HFT, I thought, well, that was a positive step. Again, going back to what we saw in the 30s, Kerry, we need some kind of public hearing where we have a bunch of these people brought up and made an example of in front of the public. And I think that coupled with another market disaster, which I think is probably in the offing here, honestly, the thing is so jacked up. I mean, Richard Fisher was doing a speech in Asia last week, and I put a bunch of quotes from his speech on the blog this morning. But it just, he's a Fed member, and he's itemizing the stuff we've been talking about for months about how extremely high market risk is in both high yield debt, in every kind of equity exchange there is, in this ridiculous practice of share buybacks, which has been the whole wind behind the big rampant stocks the past 18 months has been primarily just companies buying back their own shares, but prostrating their own balance sheet at the same time because they now have the highest corporate debt that they've had in a long time. So, that coupled with a slowdown in China, which is already underway, I think we have the makings here of the next cyclical bear market, which would be the third of the secular bear, which has the capacity to, because it's so highly levered today, make a major kerfuffle again in terms of losses, in terms of taking down major firms that are highly levered to this. And if we get all that in another public hearing, I think incrementally this all adds up to the opportunity to finally make some change and get some prosecution and hopefully clean house and start again.
Yeah, well, you're hoping for a lot, Danielle, because look who our Attorney General is in the U.S. I mean, he's been held in contempt of Congress, but as they say, hope springs eternal.
I think that the political types, though, when the public mood gets to a certain point, we had moments of it last week, Kerry, where the shock of hearing what's been going on with HFT, having that explained in a way that the average bear can understand, both through Michael Lewis and through people like, the 60 Minutes are very good at breaking it down and saying to the person on the street, hey, this is why you care about this. This sounds complex, but actually it's just good old-fashioned robbery. And, this should be outlawed and prosecuted. When you get that kind of disclosure and transparency and sentiment afoot, I think that's when even the most, ineffective prosecutor or politician can be shamed into getting on the right side of that trade. And I think that's all I'm expecting at some point.
Ineffective prosecutor, regulator, you repeat yourself. Yeah, I think at some point they got to do something. But, this really is complex. And, let's face it, Wall Street owns DC and DC owns Wall Street. And it's a real mess. And it's kind of like giving yourself chemotherapy. I guess it could be done, but not too many people do it. And I'm not overly optimistic here, but I do agree with you that the next crash is going to be the big one. And that will probably be the time when things really, really come together and something gets done, for better or for worse. But don't forget, we have Dodd-Frank. So let's get another Dodd-Frank commission, dig those guys up out of storage. They were hiding from prosecution for themselves. at least Dodd was. Chris Dodd, he was guilty of all sorts of nefarious dealings himself, getting favorable mortgages from the mortgage banks he was supposed to be regulating himself, and Barney Frank, man, they were like major causes of the last financial meltdown, and they managed to escape all responsibility for it. So put them in charge of this mess, and let's see them help dig us out from it, because this is a real mess.
Kerry, I agree with you individually. There's great flaws in humans, and there's a lot of misincentives and people taking money from the devil. I mean, it's a lifelong story of humanity, honestly. But there still have always been turning points where, what may seem like a small step is sort of the wave that begins it. And then all of a sudden you see people, some of the disincentives are removed. Typically it's just certain things are either because the public won't tolerate it anymore. So an example is these corrupt practices going on all the exchanges. To the extent that we don't have any other choice and we have to just go in there and be taken advantage of as a market participant, well, that's one thing. But when you start to get new exchanges coming out and saying, hey, we'll do it on a whole new platform, totally different rules, transparent, and we won't try and screw you, hey, that's an option that the average person and the average money manager is going to want to use. So I think when you get transparency and it's completely indefensible, many of these policies, that's when people can choose something else. And that's where I think the change finally comes from. It's not that you're ever going to find a perfect saint in any of this stuff, but it's when you get enough at the margin controls or restrictions or prosecutions, and you get some free market business models that spring out of that and say, hey, I'm in some ways that's how we started our company. We left a large institution and said, hey, we want to start a very honest, accountable management company that controls the risk for individuals, that doesn't take fees from anybody else, that doesn't have conflicts of interest, that doesn't collect commissions, that only works for our client, that charges you one fee in a transparent way, on and on. And when the world has those alternatives in it, all of a sudden people say, hey, that sounds better than what I've been getting. I'm going to go try that. And the market slowly corrects itself. I think all we've had so far, we've had this confluence of complacency, of ignorance, of opaqueness, and a bunch of crooks being unchecked in what they're doing. And so it's a lot of different people have to see that there's other opportunities, start different business models, start talking about what's wrong with the existing, and then have a few people made, poster children for everything that went on, and that sort of filters into the fear of God or whatever is put back into some of the participants, and eventually you get that change. We're not looking for perfection. We're just looking for some reasonable accountability and getting people swinging for the fences onto their own risk platform and get them off the public purse. That's another major one, because that has a very sobering effect on participants.
Well, a little cleansing sunlight can't hurt, that's for sure. And look, nobody heard of Battis a week ago. Now they're a household name. And one thing is you don't want your trades going through them. You don't want to be anywhere near them. You don't want them touching your stock. And you will do anything not to have a trade executed through them, right?
Well, you see, that's what I mean. That's just one example, but where the person is put on a public platform and everyone makes the decision and says, ooh, that's disgusting. I don't want that. And all of a sudden, the tides of commerce move to a different direction. Yeah,
so true. So there is something to be said for it. Reputation is everything. And once the transparency's there and these dirty dealers come to light, their reputations will be nothing, hopefully. Although, look, the same wrongdoers, Danielle, keep getting fined billions of dollars over and over and over again, and they seem to be thriving. So,
isn't it amazing when you watch the subtitles across the bottom of any news network in the morning business news? Every other headline is about some bank settling some major claim and paying a fee. and it's billions of dollars, but it's still those coins being tossed at the regulators on their way by, because they're still it's a cost of their doing business still at this point. So I think we actually have to get some jail time, because that, as I say, is quite a sobering effect on the C-suite.
Yeah, I think it's the ultimate disincentive to engage in this wrongdoing. Anyway, you find Danielle on jugglingdynamite.com, and your other site, Danielle?
venablepark.com.
And of course, sign up for a newsletter, and financialsurvivalnetwork.com for the links right to Danielle's site. Don't forget to sign up for a newsletter. Danielle, we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Thanks, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.